So the title of today's conference is Discovering New Evidence of Early Pre-Hispanic Sites in the Northern Highlands of Ecuador. This is an area where I have conducted research with other colleagues for several years, more or less about 12 years. So I know most of you may not be familiar with archaeology in Ecuador. So just to start a little bit, I want to give you a bit of information of the time periods we use in archaeology there. So first we start talking about the most recent time period. We are going to talk about the Inca. The Incas were only 100 years in Ecuador, so there's not much, there are not that many sites or a material culture to work with, but so that's why we generally focus in the other time periods. So the next one is the Integration period that you can see here. The Integration period is right before the Incas. Then we have the Regional Development period. That's a time period that we know very well what is going on in the coast, but not in the highlands or in the Amazon region. And then we have the Formative and the Paleolithic. And the Formative is actually the time period that we are going to discuss today. But as you can see in the area of the coast, we have a lot of information, again, of what is going on there, but we don't have much information about what was going on in the highlands or in the Amazon. And that was something that happened until probably 2010, when we discovered new sites from the Formative in the highlands. And now we can actually define exactly or establish exactly what was, how the people were living back in the day, and what type of material culture they used to have or create. So the Formative period is between 3500 BC to 500 before Christ. And this time period is interesting because it's when pottery begins, when human groups start to become more sedentary, when agriculture also begins, and it's more important for people in general. And then we also start to see a bit of an expansion of villages. So they used to be more small, they used to be more circular, they used to be more in an oval shape, and they will be only a few houses as part of the village. And then they start to grow into bigger settlements with central plaza, and they used to have more cemeteries. So we start to see how, again, these human groups settle, and then they start to like spread, to say so. We also start to see more contact between these sites. So we will find pieces that have come from the coast in the highlands, despite how far they are, of course, in terms of distance, and how difficult it would have been to travel between an area with lots of mountains and volcanoes to an area where, of course, next to it is the sea. So seeing all that exchange of products is also something very interesting of this time period. And I was mentioning pottery. So here we have two examples of pottery. We have what we call the Venus of Bolivia, which are these anthropomorphic figures that are very characteristic of the pottery of the coast. And even if it's from the beginnings of pottery, you can see a lot of great detail into these ceramic figurines. So the first site that I'm going to talk about is Cotocollao. Cotocollao is the only site that we had information of that is located in the highlands, and it's from the formative period. And it remained that way until, as I said, 2010, when we started finding new sites. This site has an early settlement and has late settlement. The early settlement is between 2,400 years to 1,200, more or less. It was discovered when there were like urbanization works in the area, and some human bones started to appear, and people were shocked, and they had to stop these works. And then a group of archaeologists started digging there, and they found a huge site, one of the most important ones in Ecuador. So what happens in this early settlement is that there was a group of houses that were located in a slope close to two ravines or ravines that surround the site. These houses were small. They were built with bareque, which is building technique that includes the mixture of mud and clay with sticks and canes to make it more like strong, this mixture. Unfortunately, most of these houses didn't got well preserved because of course, the materials. But what we found when digging them is that there are lots of ceramics, lots of obsidian artifacts, lots of grinding stones that we often call manos and metates. And archaeologists also found lots of faunal remains. So when they decided to start particularly the burials, they found that from this early settlement there were only 13 burials that we can see here in the middle of the presentation. This is of a tomb that had actually multiple burials, but most of the burials from this site were actually just individual burials. Here on the left, we can see an example of the village. So you can see that the black holes represent post holes that were meant to keep the walls and the roof of the construction. And we also can see evidence of some herds in the area. We can see some of them here. And we can also see some of the pottery. They have a lot of interesting shapes that were not seen before in the highlands, only in the coast. And because of that, for example, like in this bottle here, we have the idea that there is a connection, a strong connection between people from Cotocollao and people from a culture in the coastal area called Chorrera, because only in those two sites we have seen this type of ceramic vessels. So in terms of the burials in Cotocollao, there were only 13, as I already said, and often they were only primary interments, which mean the body was placed in the tomb and was never disturbed until archaeologists started to excavate them. Usually they only have one individual. What is interesting about this site is that from all those 13 burials, 12 had a body that was surrounded by rocks, as you can see in the picture, and only one individual was buried without rocks. So that makes us question what is the real significance of these rocks. Were they placed there in the burial as a grave good, or were they just part of the way the burials used to be constructed back in the day? So that's a question that we still haven't figured out, because why some individuals have rocks, and then there's one that doesn't have. In terms of the position of the bodies, they usually were placed in a very flexed position, with the arms and the legs very close to the chest, and then they were placed in what we call a decubitus lateral position, which means they were placed over one of their arms, the left or the right. Besides the rocks, there were no gravewoods in the area, and the tombs were actually very shallow and had an oval or circular shape. The remains were analyzed by Dr. Douglas Balaker. I don't know if any of you is familiar with that name, but it's actually a physical and forensic anthropologist that is very famous. He's from the States, and he has done lots of analysis of human remains in all over the world. So then we have the late settlement of Cotocollao. The late settlement starts between 1200 to 361 before Christ. Of course, as you can see in the picture, the settlement has become a lot bigger. There are lots of communal areas for burying people, and we have lots of houses spread between the two ravines. This place, the place in general has lots of herds, has lots of evidence of artifacts, even more than in the early settlement. And we have a lot of evidence from agriculture, because we have found carbonized seeds from beans, a lot of maize, potatoes, quinoa, etc. So we know that people were, we're not talking about the beginning of agriculture. We are talking about a settlement that has been living from agriculture for a very long time. We are just missing that in between the early settlement and the late, where they are using more and more agriculture, and we haven't found that yet. In terms of the burials, there were about almost 200 individuals buried at the site. The tombs were of different depths, and the shape of the tombs was never well defined. We have two layers of burials in this period. We have a very a layer that is at a much more depth, where in general the shape of the tombs was more oval or more circular and well defined, and the individuals were placed individually and with lots of artifacts, either obsidian or ceramics. And then we have an upper layer that has burials that are not defined, and it seems like people were in a rush when they were placing these individuals, and all individuals were covered by a layer of rocks. What archaeologists have suggested is that all this rush may be linked to something that was happening back in the day, that is basically a volcanic eruption. And probably this volcanic eruption happened or took place. A lot of people died, and the people that were still alive were tried to bury their beloved ones quickly, and then they abandoned the site. We actually don't know where did they move to. So that's kind of like the hypothesis that we have about this site. So yeah, we have individuals that were not covered properly, they got destroyed, and then, as I said, back in the 1970s, there were construction works, there were urbanization works in the area, and they were not aware of the site, so they actually destroyed a lot of it too. So most of the remains unfortunately got destroyed as well, and we haven't been able to recover that much information. But it's still interesting that we have around 200 burials, because it's the site from the formative in the highlands that had most has that many burials in comparison to others. Then we have a new site. The site is Rancho Bajo. I started working in this site when I was still an undergraduate student. It was discovered in 2011, and one of my professors actually was called and asked to work in this site. So here we found around 28 burials. I say around because a lot of the area has already houses on it, and that was certainly a limitation that we had in terms of how much we can excavate or dig. So we could see when we opened units and we were excavating that in the walls of the unit there were more bodies or more human remains, but we could not dig them and take them out because close to us was the wall of a house or something, and there was a lot of risk of that wall falling into the unit. So there was a lot of risk there. But we have studied those 28 burials very well. As you can see, something interesting between Rancho Bajo and Cotocollao is that they are relatively close. And they are not only close in terms of distance, but they are also close in terms of the artifacts we have found in Rancho Bajo. Because in upper deposits, in Rancho Bajo, we have found some pieces of ceramic that are typical from Cotocollao. So that's kind of like a link that we have between those two sites. So here we have photos of the excavation seasons. We have had so far 3 seasons. I have been involved in the first 2, and the third one I couldn't be I couldn't work on it because I was in Canada actually doing my master's. But you can see some of the burials here, and you can see that they are individual, which is cool. You don't have that mixture of human bones or faunal bones that you can see on other sites. So in terms of the shape of the tomb, the tombs were actually very shallow. The form is not well defined. Most of the burials are individual. Only some may have 2 individuals. The burials are also primary, which means they were placed and left in that way. And only a few have been considered secondary burials. In the first picture, for example, we can see a body, and next to it we have a mandible. I don't know if you can see it. It's actually probably not the best photo. And the mandible was left alone there. So that's why I say we have some burials that may be secondary. In terms of the position of the bodies in the tomb, they were also very flexed, with the arms and legs close toward the chest. And something interesting about these burials is that lots of Kangawa blocks, which is a material made of it's very compact. It results from volcanic eruptions. These blocks were placed surrounding the bodies, and there next to these Kangawa blocks were also rocks. So it's a pattern that we have seen also in Cotocollao. And again, that and the ceramic that we found makes us think that there was connection between these two sites. There was only one grave good technically in the site, which is the one that we can see in the middle. This is a pendant that was made with polished basalt, which is a type of hard rock. And there is another one, which is an obsidian core. The basalt pendant is found next to the remains of a juvenile, and the nuclear core was found next to an adult. So it makes us think, what was the meaning of these two individuals out of 28 having these elements? Because the other ones don't have anything else buried next to them, right? And here we have also some examples of the obsidian that was found in the area, and some of these fragments of ceramic vessels have characteristics of Cotocollao. We have another site, which is the new airport, Unit 95. So basically, when the new International Quito Airport was under construction, the people started finding lots of human remains while digging to build the airport runways. So they called several archaeologists, and they started doing excavations there, and they found several cemeteries. One of them is the one we call Unit 95. Unit 95 was found in 2010. Here we have a drawing of that we always have to do, a drawing of the skeleton and how it was buried, just to have more detail. As I'm going to explain, all these skeletons were placed over a floor of adobe, which is a mixture of soil and water, and then it has been, people have stepped over it to make it hard, of a hard consistency, and then they were covered again with this layer of adobe. So most of the burials were had these characteristics, but then we have one that is very different from the others. Is the one that we can see in this picture here, and this one has rocks from the river, and they were covering the body basically. So it makes us wonder, what is the difference from with this individual, right? Does it come from another settlement, or was he someone important in the settlement? We still don't know about that. So 21 burials were recovered. You can see here pictures of these adobe floors and how they were placed below the individual, or the individual was placed over it. And then we have the grave goods, which are only two. So basically, only two burials had grave goods. One had this pendant of obsidian, and the other one had spondylus. And one was a male and one was a female. So what we believe is that these two individuals were important in the settlement, and that's why they were buried with these. What is also interesting is the fact that we have a seashell here as a grave good, which means that there was connection between the settlement and people from the coast, right? The burials here were again primary, and they were individual. We have a Unit 12, again in the same area of the new Quito airport. Here, archaeologists did not only found a cemetery, but they also found domestic contexts. So basically, an area where people from the settlement used to live. Only 8 burials were found in this area, next to the domestic. And we have also obsidian artifacts. And we have an area that archaeologists have considered an area of household garbage, with terrestrial snails, and also with evidence of beans. So we know at least that they were eating that. So here are the burials of Unit 8. They were again individual. They were placed in a flex position as the individuals from Unit 95. There were no grave goods at all, but we don't know what is the meaning of this accumulation of rocks that were fractured by fire that were placed next to each individual. So we know that they play an important role in terms of the funerary practice in Unit 8, but we still don't know the meaning of it. And The tombs here were actually very shallow, kind of oval. So in 2014, I was finishing my undergrad studies, and I conducted a research as part of my thesis. This research focused on studying the funerary practices of all the sites that I have mentioned before. So just to mention a few details, basically there were no patterns between these sites that can actually let us know for sure there was contact between them. Only probably between Cotocollao and Rancho Bajo, but we are still not sure. Then we can say definitely that people used to place the bodies in a position with limbs extremely flexed towards the chest. But there are differences. Some were like seated, others were placed over their arm. So there's no pattern there. We have also seen that sex and age didn't play a role in of these funerary practices. And also when examining the demography, because I was in charge of doing the analysis, the osteological analysis to determine the sex and age of all the individuals, I was able to establish that there were no similarities in terms of demography between these sites. So some sites have only adults, some sites have adults and juvenile remains, and then the number of females and males was very different between all the sites. In terms of grave widths, only 1% of the burials are grave widths, and they are all different between sites, so there's also no pattern there. Then it comes Las Orquídeas. So Las Orquídeas was discovered back in 2013. I also work at this site. I ran all the osteological analysis. And when I moved into my master's, I decided to include this into my research. So my research was included basically Las Orquídeas, which is in a different province from all the other sites I mentioned before, but it's still in the highlands. And I included Rancho Bajo and Cotocollao, and I will explain that later. But basically, Las Orquídeas, what it's cool is that besides finding the burials, we also have an area that where a lot of activity was going on. We have a huge amount of artifacts. We have stone tools, we have ceramics, we have beads of seashells, we have different raw materials. We have mother of pearl, we had precious stones too. It's a very, very cool site. Here we have some of the examples we have seen. What is cool, for example, about this gold bead is that a similar one was found in Peru, and only in those two sites, like in Peru and in Las Orquídeas in Ecuador. So we wonder if there was a connection between Peru and this human group in Ecuador, or what is going on. Anyway, so we can see here's beads. We have some of the ceramic figurines we have found. Again, adornments for the nose, and we have the mother pearl plaques and a lot of obsidian. We have approximately 100,000 fragments of these fragments in the site. Here we have some of the tombs. It's very weird, this area, this site in terms of the tombs, because they were located in more of an area that was full of garbage from that period. So it seems that these people may have not been that important. We still there are no patterns in terms of the position of the body in the burial, or in terms of the shape of the burial or the tomb. But it's interesting that only one of the individuals of the 8 ones that were found so far had these 2 ceramic vessels as our grave cloth. So basically, my research when I moved into my master's was analyzing all the bones, the human bones and the faunal bones, using stable isotopes to establish their diet. This was interesting because some of the sites have ceramics, others don't have ceramics, and because they are close to the Paleolithic, we were not sure if they're only hunter-gatherers or if they already used to consume a lot of maize. So if you're not familiar with isotopes, I know there's another later with that Kevin has organized where you're going to talk about isotopes, but just to give you a little bit of an idea, when we have values in terms of carbon isotopes that are close between -22 and -20, that means that the animal or the individual used to consume a lot of C3 plants, which are plants that naturally grow there. But when we have values when our carbon isotope values goes to -10, -6, -8, then that means that the individual used to consume a lot of maize, basically just maize. So what we are going to decide here is that there's an in-between. They have already started to consume maize, but wasn't a huge part of their diet. So starting with Rancho Bajo, which is the one that is here in red, you can see that it's kind of close to the isotopic signal of other animals. And those animals were basically, as you can see, they're in -21, -19. They were just eating C3 plants, right? Like grass, any other fruits or vegetables, but nothing like maize. So we know that people in Rancho Bajo were eating just a tiny bit of maize, enough for them to change their isotopic signal and show they have been eating a little bit of maize. Another thing of Rancho Bajo is that all the signal of these people is clustered together, which means that they were all having basically the same food. They were all sharing. Probably someone handed something and they were all sharing a small group as a community. When examining the signal of the people from Cotocollao, either the early and the late settlement, we can see that they have an isotopic signal that is very similar from Rancho Bajo. This is because archaeologists in the 1970s found a lot of evidence of maize, and they suggested that people in Cotocollao were eating maize basically every single day. And we can actually see now that they were not eating that much maize. But we can see that their diet was a bit more different from Rancho Bajo because the isotopic signal of the individuals is a bit more different. Isn't that clustered together? So there was a lot more variety in terms of products and crops they were eating. When adding the isotopic of Las Orquídeas, we can actually see that this site is very different from Cotocollao and Rancho Bajo because they were eating a lot more maize. Now we're talking about that is apart or at a greater distance from Rancho Bajo and Cotocollao. In another province, the weather there is a little bit different. The geography of that area is a little bit different too. And also, what is cool is that we have an individual from Las Orquídeas that has an isotopic signal very different from the other individuals, which means that this individual was eating a lot more maize compared to the people in that time period. Yeah. Also, something interesting is that here you can see this isotopic signal of two samples of deer. You can see that these two deers are eating also a bit more maize. So their diet was actually closer to the ones of these individuals, which is cool, right? Because all the other animals are only eating C3 plants, but these two are starting to eat more maize. And we wonder if they are kind of like more domesticated, if they're living close to the settlement or not. These samples are also come from Las Orquídeas, so they're having a very similar there. Finally, I decided to compare the results from my study to a study that was conducted in 2015 by Carly Pennycook. Carly used samples from she used samples from two sites that are called Tajam, which is again in the Northern Highlands, and then a different cemetery from the ones I have explained to you that is also in the New Quito airport. What is interesting here is that here we have my sites, the sites from the formative, and here we have Carly's sites. And these sites show a lot of consumption of maize, which is not a surprise because they are from the subsequent time periods. But we can see one of the individuals from Las Orquídeas is actually close to their isotopic signal, just in a very different time period. There's other, and then another site that Carly studied is the site in the new airport, and the people here have an almost isotopic signal as the people in Rancho Bajo and Cotocollao. So it makes us question ourselves why people back in integration period, which is close to the Incas, we're still having almost no amount of maize or a little amount of maize. And it's something that we never thought before. We used to think that the consumption of maize will start increasing progressively through time periods, and now we're seeing that actually no, there are a lot of subsistence economies there, and people even in the integration period not eating that much maize. Finally, I decided also to compare the results of my study to a site called that is the site is that we have clear evidence of people of high status. We have these very interesting tombs. We have a lot of great goods. We know for sure they were very important people. So when comparing them, we still don't know if they're from the regional development period or the integration period, so we consider them both. But again, these people are high status. They are eating a lot of maize. They are eating chicha, which is a fermented beverage made of maize. And this person, this individual from Las Orquídeas, has a very similar signature. Now, something interesting about this individual, again, from Las Orquídeas, is that this is the only person from Las Orquídeas that had a grave goods. And it has, again, another isotopic signal, which makes us think that it comes from a very different settlement. So now it makes us know that there are people in the formative from other settlements that even consume more maize than people in Rancho Bajo, than people in Cotocollao, than people in Las Orquídeas. But we haven't found that site yet. So yeah, basically that's what I found in these two research that I conducted, and what my colleagues have found too during years of almost a decade, basically, of excavations. Yeah, I don't know if you have any comments or any questions.